Are you stuck in the same old routine at work? Do you find yourself hitting a creative wall, unable to see beyond your current perspective? It's time to break free and unlock the power of fresh perspectives. Hello, David Gouthro back with another episode of Discover Fresh Perspectives. Today, I have as my guest Reza Rahmani. Welcome, Reza.
Thank you, David. Super excited to be here.
So, Reza, when we were talking just a little bit beforehand about what we might want to talk about, you mentioned a number of different things that'd be interesting to dive into. But before we do that, just so people have a sense of the perspective or the lens that you come at whatever we talk about is, maybe you could just say a little bit about your background and what you're doing now.
Yeah, thank you. So I don't know any coaches that had a straight path into coaching. Everyone has really interesting stories coming into coaching. So for mine, I started my career in engineering. Reason why engineering, growing up with immigrant parents, the career options are very well defined and laid out. So my parents were like, hey, you have 4 choices: doctor, lawyer, accountant, engineer. And it really came down to process of elimination because I hated blood. I didn't know anything about biology. And any of the other subjects. And I was like, okay, I guess math and, sciences, I'm decent at it. So I practiced engineering for about 7-8 years.
Okay.
I like the problem solving part of it. I like, systems. I was working on clean energy. So I was having positive impact.
Mm-hmm.
But I wanted to have more impact through people and through various, I tried a bunch of different engineering roles. I even went to procurement and supply chain management and so on because there was a chance to work with a lot more people.
Mm-hmm.
That still wasn't it. And I somehow fell into HR because I had a good relationship with the head of HR in that firm when I was first hired as an engineer. And he was a certified coach. And he said, Reza, would you be open to coach training? And I was always big on personal growth. I used to go to a lot of seminars and, self-improvement things. And I was like, yeah, free training if you're willing to invest. Like, I'm all for it. And the first module in coach training, I fell in love with it. I was like,
Oh, wow.
This is really the profession, but I just didn't quite know what it was called. And then the rest is history. So I started practicing internally. I was leading HR. I was an internal coach. And then I went out on my own about eight years ago. I started my own practice.
Now, there's been an explosion of people that do coaching in different places to get certified and things like that. And, just as broad a range of things people might be coaching about. So is there a particular aspect of coaching that you really like to focus in on that you're passionate about?
Yeah, that's a good question. I coach all different facets, but I guess if I were to pick sort of my sweet spot, one is I tend to work more with data-driven, analytical-minded leaders, maybe because of my past life. I can sort of connect with that audience. And I think it can sort of help bridge the gap between emotional intelligence, emotional way of thinking about things versus that rational, cerebral part and kind of marry the two. But also a lot of, nowadays, a lot of leaders are going through big transitions. That's when a lot of times, they start working with a coach. So they can look like they just got a promotion into a new job, or they went through a merger and acquisition, or the company is going through some sort of big change. So those are most of the time that, they feel like they need some support to manage through the ambiguity, through the uncertainty, and kind of make sense of this new world that they're stepping into. And that's where I partner with them.
Okay. So I'll dive into that in just a second, because whenever someone says something, it brings back memories from the past. And I used to do a lot of leadership development with Shell Canada out of Calgary.
Yeah.
And talking to my client at the time, he was very interested, as was I in emotional intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
And but having largely an engineering mentality, and the folks coming into these programs, it's like, if it doesn't have any numbers, we probably shouldn't be spending time on it. So then I got certified in the Hay-McBurr model, the Emotional Intelligence Competency Inventory, which had a ton of numbers. And all of a sudden, it was okay to be talking about emotional intelligence. This is quite a few years ago. It's much more common now, but
Right.
But I diverged. I distracted myself. So when you're talking about,
But you're absolutely right. Let's sorry, just on that. Like
Yeah.
that was such a spot on insight. As anything with numbers, any kind of research and anything I'm generalizing in the corporate world, amen. Like that's what seems to resonate more nowadays. So
Yeah, and it's unfortunate that there's still this view very commonly held that if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And for some things that's true, but for other things, you end up doing is making up numbers or putting something that has the illusion of being scientifically based or accurate, just so that people will allow themselves to enter into the conversation.
exactly.
Right? It can
Exactly.
be
I think a lot of people have figured that out. So they just put some numbers behind
that's right.
and sell
Yeah.
it as, research based.
And in the age of fake news, like, oh yeah, well, research says, and what research would that be,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
Don't ask that question. Don't just trust me, right? I'm at the front of the room. Okay, so transition. You've got all of these folks that are transitioning. It's a incredibly, like we talk about, being a VUCA environment that's volatile and certain, complex and ambiguous, and all that sort of thing. And plus all the things that are happening in the economy, that's got to be even ramping up more. So maybe you could walk us through the steps if you were going to be coaching me, because around transition. What kind of conversation might we have?
Yeah. I mean, it depends again on the context of what the transition is. If it's, a career change nowadays, that's another common thing. Like, back in the day, people would had one job and you would hold it like for a lifetime. But nowadays, like every 3 to 5 years, it's common that you would change your career or even modify and tweak it in some ways. So one of the things I always start with that I think is foundational is values, right? Values is, sort of pillars to who we are authentically. And a lot of people obviously know their values, but just going through an exercise and being able to name and articulate, well, what do I really want to stand for? What are the things that really matter to at the end of the day? That can help ground people in an environment where there seems to be a lot of uncertainty and a lot of change.
I would. Uh, I'm not sure that's necessarily true that everyone knows what their values are. At least that's not been my experience. That
Yeah.
you ask people what their values are, and they'll quite often say, "Good question." Then they'll have 3 or 4 or 5, right? And just, the easy part is coming up with the words. I think the harder part is digging into, so why is that a value? How does that play itself out in its life? When do you find yourself compromising that value? And what are the ones that are so definitional to you that if you can't live those, you wouldn't be able to look at yourself in the mirror in the morning, right?
Great point. No, you're absolutely right. There's so many layers to values that you can explore. And then the other one that I think a lot of find insightful is actually the shadow of values. Like, tell me what your values are, and I'll tell you what are some of the blind spots that comes with it. Like a lot of leaders, and again, going back to the engineering world, like excellence is a value that they, uphold really high. It's really ingrained to their DNA and how they approach things. Then we talk about, well, what could be some of the downsides of having excellence as a core value. And a lot of times they don't really think about that, right? Well, it could be like you're just going over precision or perfection over progress, right? Or it could impact psychological safety in some ways because you're coming across as overly critical all the time and finding what's not working. We can have some really fun, interesting conversations there. And it helps opens up sort of the perspective how to hold that value in its best essence, not just, and it's kind of the shadow side.
Now, something that I've heard about and know nothing about, so, this may be not a great question, but, I hear about everything being strength based to build on your strengths and things like that. And I don't know if those folks that work in that area also talk about the shadow side of that, because I think it is, you're going to be more effective if you build on your strengths for sure, rather than marginally improving your weaknesses, if we can call them that. But, too much of a good thing, like, ice cream, it has its impact on me. Well, let me give you a specific situation maybe to relate to, or category of situations. And that's where these days I find as companies are reorganizing, sometimes they'll take someone who's been a really effective leader in one area and they'll hear, we really need you to lead this area over here.
Right.
Right, which is kinda like a forced transition. So, maybe you
Yes.
could talk a little bit through what are some of the things that might come up in that kind of a transition, and how might you help someone navigate that?
Yeah. No, you're right. That happens a lot, especially, as now there's, a lot of reduction in force and people are asked to do more with
Mhm.
with less resources. And sometimes there's good intentions behind it. Like they see someone is doing so well in one area, like, okay, well, let's take Jane and move them over here because they did such a fantastic job. But that's not really their strength. So what I always start with is going back. We start with strengths. So what helped you be successful
Mhm.
in this first area, and what are some of the transferable mindsets, skills, patterns that you've noticed that helped you create success in here? But sometimes too, like those become bottlenecks. What helped you become successful in this first role now is gonna get in the way of creating that. This is especially true, for a lot of people who were doers, right? They were always the counter on to deliver results and get in there, solve big problems. And that exact same behavior now at some stage when they have to lead, in complex environments with big teams, and they're always the doer, they become, the rate limiting step sort of in scaling the organization. So is creating awareness around, well, sometimes, what got you here kind of won't get you there sort of adage, right? So, and this is where actually I do a 360 feedback for leaders as well in this new environment that they're in. I do like a interview based one because I find surveys are good, but a lot of times you have to read in between the lines, or people give you something that you have no idea actually what it really means.
Mhm.
So we partner together and become really intentional. Say, well, what are some feedback you really want to get
Mhm.
from this whole experience? And I probe around that in the conversations with the team that they work with closely. That becomes really good data that they can use to create success in this new environment that they're stepping into.
So I like that it's it's a system approach to it in a way. It's not an individual because there's a context it works in, an environment, and it's tough to do something. Well, it's may not. I'm great at metaphors that don't work, so let me try this one. It's kind of like if you're trying to get someone to quit smoking, and then they have the conversations in a bar where everyone's
Right.
smoking. Like
Yeah.
it's really hard to bring about a change in an environment like that.
Yeah. That was a good metaphor, actually.
Oh, okay.
That worked well.
Let me just put this in my calendar for future reference.
Yes, exactly. So it is about utilizing the environment because, like you could define success in a really abstract or a kind of intellectual way, but unless you kind of talk to people, like it can be very disconnected. The other piece, and this is kind of commonplace nowadays, is you create like a 90-day plan, they call it, right? So
Mhm.
before you create any big change is really listening a lot. So going through kind of a feedback sort of tour, if you will, like talking to all the key stakeholders that you need to serve in this new environment, and asking them like what's working and what's not working here. So and utilizing all of that information to make really intentional change. And if you are actually introducing that, building on what's working, because a lot of times people come into a new space and they're like, okay, I'm just gonna bring my own stuff here, bring my own systems, and creates a lot of resistance, right? Because people feel not acknowledged for all the hard work they've done before. They feel criticized. So it's first appreciating what's actually working here, and kind of building on that rather than just throwing everything out, baby with the bathwater, and starting fresh based on what you think works.
So let's step away from the process for a minute and look at the person. And here's the reason I asked this question. I used to like a lot of my friends and colleagues were going through coaching training like years ago, and we need to have so many hours of practice, can we practice on you and stuff like that. And I ended up just getting really frustrated with that. Just because you kind of see the line coming or the phrase or the here's step number 3 now. But I also came to the conclusion that's totally self-defeating that I'm largely uncoachable because I've, worked with a number of coaches. I've paid people for coaching and I never benefit from it, and it never has anything to do with the coach. So it's
Right.
all about me. So if you were to describe the avatar for someone who's an ideal coaching client, what would that be? Because sometimes people come for coaching, other times they're told to go for coaching by their organization.
Yeah.
So what's sort of the mindset, or how could you determine if this person is actually going to benefit from coaching, if there is a way to do that?
Yeah, that's a great point. Couple of things that has stood out for me working with different leaders. I mean, it normally is not a great idea if someone is told you need coaching, but they're not really, sort of enrolled in that,
Mhm.
and that's not a great recipe for success. And sometimes it is remedial coaching too. So they've already decided they want to fire this person, and they're like, okay, well, let's give him one last shot
Right.
before we tell. So they feel like we've really given them our best kind of thing. So those are not obviously good situations.
Relieving their guilt.
Yeah, exactly. So it's more about the employer than about the leader at that point. But a couple of things that sounds out. One is, you know, that kind of curiosity. So being willing to examine some of the stories that we tell ourselves, being willing to examine, our thoughts, being willing to examine, how we do things, right? And not that it's wrong, but just saying, okay, well, this set of behaviors has really worked for me in the past. Are they still working for me in this time and place? Or do I need to modify it in some ways? It's really that intentionality that kind of goes a long way. They don't need to necessarily change it, but pausing and reflecting.
Okay.
And I mean, that can be uncomfortable, right? Because you really have to kind of have a closer look at yourself, what you believe in, and so on. That's where a coach you can partner with and create a safe environment when you can sort of explore those kind of places. That's number one. And then number two is it's good to have a lot of intellectual discussions. It really comes down to applying it, right? This is where rubber kind of hits the road. So being willing to then experiment with some of these new insights or new ideas that are coming out of a coaching discussion, and sort of being able to talk about it in a conversation, saying, hey, like I tried this thing, but it actually didn't work. Can we kind of unpack that a little bit? And then we get curious around why it didn't work, what did we learn from it, what do we want to tweak next time? So it's a bit of an iterative process sometimes in coaching as well. But what happens sometimes is people's calendars are so full nowadays, right? You could have brilliant conversation and there's some actions that even comes out of it. And then next conversation, like Reza, I totally even forgot we were talking about this thing. So then we're kind of slipping our wheels a little bit. Like we're having a lot of great discussions, but change is not really happening through that, not taking action, right?
So I suspect there may be, a wide variety of response to this question, but in your experience, how frequently should someone be, working with a coach? So one is how long the period is like, is it 3 months or 3 years? And then how frequent in order to actually sustain some kind of a change?
Yeah, I mean, listen, behavior change or any kind of change takes time and intentionality, right? So I minimum time I work with leaders is 6 months. A lot
Okay.
of times it's actually longer. So we go into a year or sometimes a year and a half, right?
Mhm.
Um, it's most intensive the first 6 months, and then we can sort of dial back. So the first 6 months, typically we talk with leaders once every 2 weeks. That seems to be
Okay.
more of a bit of a standard, I don't know, in kind of corporate space as well. Reason why 2 weeks is there's enough time in between the sessions so people can apply some of the things that we talk about, but it's not too long that we kind of lose momentum.
Right.
That cadence seems to work well. It's like 50 minutes conversation. Some leaders actually want a little bit more frequent upfront just to create some momentum. So
Hmm.
we do maybe sometimes weekly for 30 minutes just to kind of touch base and make sure things are still top of mind, those intentions that we set for ourselves. And then we kind of scale back to go every 2 weeks. And then after 6 months, sometimes we go to monthly. So they become more of just check-ins and tweaks at, at that point. Yes.
So I'm thinking about in terms of access to a coach, so in person, online, over the phone. Any observations about those different modalities for coaching?
Yeah. Pre-COVID, I used to make an effort, or it was part of actually our agreement that I would make at least 3 in-person visits in a 6 month engagement with a leader. So the kickoff, always we used to do it like in person, just to build rapport, build connection, and then maybe someone in the midpoint when I was debriefing their 360 feedback, and then at the end. With post COVID, as you know, everything has now shifted to the virtual environment. And, although I love the in person, I think for one-on-one coaching, Zoom or Teams or whatever, it seems to work okay. Still for group stuff like group workshops or team building has to be in person. Like,
Right.
I have a bias there. But with the one-on-one, a lot of leaders actually appreciate the virtual environment because it's so much more efficient, especially
Hmm.
given how much they got going in their days. So they can just sort of dial in from wherever they are. Um, and yes, you lose some stuff, obviously, the body language and the energy and all of it. But I think the trade-off seems to still be kind of a positive trade-off for most leaders. So nowadays, that's sort of more or less my approach, anyways, is mostly virtual, and also because the leaders I work with, they're all over, kind of North America, so that
It
makes it more accessible in some ways as well.
does expand your ability to help people.
Yeah.
So another thing that I'm curious about is and perhaps it might be an artificial distinction between a counselor and a coach.
Mm,
And that sometimes I think some people that look at coaching as something it's all about helping you grow, and counseling has more of a fix something that's not right or that's broken. They're both about bringing about change,
yeah.
right? But in my mind, they're a little bit different. So is that an artificial distinction, or do you make a distinction between those two and what you see as your role, Reza?
Yeah, I think that's a good analogy, although there's a lot of overlap as well between, the two fields. Coaching has evolved, I think, as its roots in counseling, right? So there's a lot of sort of psychology that has come into it. We talk about, self-talk is one of the things I cover a lot in my approach, because I think that's so important, creating space to really be able to name and identify what are those stories or self-talk that we have with ourselves. We all have this voice in our head, and when we're under stress, this voice tends to be a lot louder, right? And it tends to say not really not nice things to us or
Mhm.
about other people. So some people, might feel that this is sort of going into the territory of counseling, but we don't go into the past of how this voice was formed or what were some early childhood experiences that maybe created this. This is where kind of counseling obviously can be helpful. We more or less just identify it and say, okay, well, what do we want to do with this? How much power do you want to give it? And what are other sort of perspectives that you might want to tap into in those stressful times that might be more helpful to help you get the results?
So mostly from present time forward rather than
Exactly. It tends
informing
to
it
be.
for the okay.
Yeah.
So
And a lot of leaders I work with, they do both, right? So they have their own
mhm.
therapists they work with, and they're having different type of conversations with the therapy. It tends to be, again, more, it's introspective. Both of them are very reflective conversations, but like you mentioned, it's more kind of looking at how some of those patterns were created. And coaching tends to be a little bit more kind of forward looking.
I'm just thinking about how some of my colleagues and some of my clients describe. Uh, some will describe their therapist and going to therapy, and for some people, it's like a badge and it's a connection. Yeah, I go to a therapist. I'm about growth. Others feel that there's some stigma attached to that, like there's something wrong. So they talk about going to their coach.
Yeah.
Right, and the process may be the same, but a different word that enables them to, tell their story, that tell other people the story they want to have it told, rather than having people make an assumption about, "Oh, you go to a therapist, there's something wrong
Something
with you,"
might be wrong
as
with you.
opposed to being a very positive thing that you actually wanna grow and you can't do it yourself and you're going to someone else for some assistance.
That's a great point. Yeah. Coaching tends to have a better branding. I don't know if that's the right way to put it, or, or not, than
Yeah.
therapy. Although it's changing, but still, yeah, I think there's stigma associated with therapy. But coaching is now embraced so much in especially corporate environments. Like a lot of high performers are given an opportunity to work with a coach, so it
Yeah.
tends to be sort of received in a more positive light.
You use the term stigma, and I did a presentation quite a few years ago about the stigma that professional speakers might have, and I think a lot of people look at stigma as something that someone else is doing to me that's causing me to be a certain way, when in fact stigma is something I hold myself. Like I believe that other people believe that this is a problem.
Right.
right?
That's
And
a great
so that
point.
right, and I carry
Yeah.
my stigma with me, and, the only way we can just destigmatize things is that I could destigmatize something is if I choose to talk about it,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But,
And I love that. And I think that's where where you see there has been some shifts in places where the destigmatizing has happened as people have felt more comfortable sharing their stories, opening up, and everyone else says, "Oh yeah, like I can relate to that because I've had similar challenges." And now all of a sudden you're in a more meaningful conversation around something, right?
and I know I could I can a number of examples come to mind, and so gender transitions and things like that years ago. Wow, you might depending on what country you're in, your life might actually be jeopardized for talking about those things, and
Yeah.
now it's much more in the public eye, and so for some people are still going to hold stigma no matter what,
Right.
but others, the more people talk about it, the more it normalizes it.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Things like that. Talking about, health issues. People never used to talk about health issues. I was on a call the other day with some colleagues from university, and, we just been checking in every 4 to 6 weeks since COVID, and one fellow said, "Yeah, I'm just, yeah, I'm feeling a little bit tired today. I just, came back from the hospital from prostate surgery."
Mm,
Well, normally there's a time when that would have totally shut down the conversation, like, we don't talk about things like that. But another person said, "Yeah, I had that surgery 20 years ago." Another one said, "My father had that." Like, all of a sudden, it was like that. It wasn't like complaining about all these things that are going on. It's just, let's just normalize it. And now what are we gonna do with it? Let's get on with life. Let's not wallow in it. But it wasn't that many years ago that you just wouldn't have that conversation.
yeah. No, 100%. And yeah, my wish is that we can keep sort of pushing the boundary when it comes to mental health.
Mhm.
Wow, right? Because yeah, physical stuff, we're now a lot more comfortable talking about it. Although in some spaces, even down south border, now some of those conversations are becoming more taboo. But sometimes you got to go through those transitions, and I'm holding optimistic lens that we can sort of evolve past that.
And I would imagine as a coach that, people's biases are gonna surface, their stigmas are gonna surface, and can't really say, "Okay, no more bias. This is a stigma-free zone," but rather the reflecting that you ask them to do, once they realize that, they can then choose how it plays itself out in their life, if it's working for them or not working. But the first
Yeah.
step is recognizing it.
Great point. Yeah, we were never going to get rid of our biases. We're just built as human beings as a survival mechanism, right? So it's more just being aware of our biases and how it's serving or not serving us in certain contexts, right?
Yeah. Now, in one of our previous conversations, you just sort of dropped this little thought about, well, this is kind of like, um, getting better being a tennis player or something like that. So
Yeah.
I'd love to just kind of get a sense of what you actually meant by that.
Yeah. So tennis is one of my hobbies and, passions outside of work. In a past life, I think every man wished at some point they would be a professional athlete. I think that's the dream a lot of men have. But yeah, so I love tennis, and the reason why is, I mean, it's such mindfulness type of a practice, right? When you're out in the tennis court, and I mean any sports for what matters, you have to be so present
Mhm.
with whatever's going on. You have to keep your eye on the ball. You have to pay attention to the environment, to yourself. And I see a lot of parallels between coaching and
Mm,
playing tennis. There's a lot of self-reflection and self-awareness that comes with it, especially if you're playing more at the competitive level and you're playing matches.
mm,
There's the technique gets you only so far, but what really distinguishes, top athletes and the ones that have, the Federer and Djokovic, those guys that have won so many Grand Slams, it really comes down to that mental toughness, the resilience, their mindsets, how they can reset after a big loss or making a big mistake, and they don't let that affect the rest of the game. And I see so many parallels between coaching, leadership, and how you show up on a tennis court, and that's one of the reasons why it really kind of appeals to me.
I remember years ago reading a book, and I might get both the name of the book and the name of the author wrong, but it seems to me it was called Inner Tennis, and it was, I
The
think,
inner game of tennis. Yeah.
yeah, and Tim Galloway, and
Mm.
one of the things he talked about is one of the instructors, he'd be instructing these high power executives that'd be coming in for the tennis lesson. They pretty soon realized that before they could start doing tennis lesson, they had to do some stress management, right? Because like I said, it's not about the skill, strictly about the skill. It's about the mental space to be able to perform at your best.
Yeah. Exactly. And I mean, in coaching, we use kind of similar terminology. We say we're going to work on your inner game and outer game.
Right.
Outer
Okay.
game are the skills, competencies, behaviors that everyone can see. And a lot of time that gets attention. Inner game is what's happening between your ears, right? So how you're viewing challenges, how you're viewing yourself, how you're viewing the world. And that's like, actually, I find that's like 80% is really that inner game. 20% is the skill set. But a
Right.
lot of people first come into coaching because they want to work on the skill set, and we work on that.
Yeah, I've heard the same thing of golf, and I'd say the same thing as people learning to be a coach, just like any
Yeah.
other skill, right? So,
Yes.
yeah.
Exactly. I mean, you can learn all the mechanics of being a great coach, of asking good questions and listening, but are you truly kind of having the whole person in mind? And that's where distinguishes like a good coach from a great coach, is they can all the other bits that may not be visible, or when someone's talking about something but their body language said something else.
Yeah.
You can have a go kind of deeper a little bit in those areas.
Very cool.
Yeah.
So, I'm a colleague, and I asked you if it was okay to ask you this question earlier. I've not asked any other folks I've had this conversation with, and or this podcast with, and this may decide if I've ever asked again. But a good friend and colleague of mine, Cody Schuin, has written a book on legacy. And so, one of the things I was wondering if you're willing to talk about it, and there will be no judgment, there is no scoring, is as what kind of legacy would you like to leave behind? What would you like people uh, to remember you for? What difference have you made in the world as a result of being on the planet for quite a few years? If anything comes to mind, I realize it's a deep question. I'm just curious to see what might come top of mind for you, Reza.
Yeah. I mean, that is a deep question. And no, I think it's a very great question to ask as well. So I don't have kids, right? And then we're not planning to have kids. We do have a lot of nieces and nephews in our lives. So when you say the word legacy, I mean, for a lot of people, I think where they would go is about, being a parent and the impact they have with their children. For me, I think actually one of the other reasons why coaching has really appealed to me is really the impact, a legacy I think I could create
Mhm.
through my work. And it really, I mean, it sounds pretty cheesy, but it's sort of leaving people a little bit better than when I first met them. And the better it really comes down into how they define better, not how I define better. It can look like being a little bit less reactive, can look like being kinder, gentler to people they work with, or being more authentic in who they are. And all of those, I mean, and the ripple effects that when it creates in one person, the ripple effects in their environment and their circles, that really, that gives me a lot of gratitude and gives me a lot of joy. And that what kind of fuels me to be able to do this work.
It just occurred to me that a legacy can almost serve the purpose of a personal vision. If
Yeah.
if that's what I want to leave behind,
Mm.
how does that inform the work that I do today?
That's a great, yeah, I love that. And actually, visioning is one of the things we do in coaching, is pausing and saying, okay, well, what's the vision you're holding for yourself, for your team, for your family? So there's a lot of parallels.
This makes me think back to something. I'm also feeling guilty for not doing much about or anything about it. But years ago, so our daughter's 25 now, and when she was quite young, I registered a website that was a better world for Anna.
Oh yeah. Wow.
So I
Yeah.
thought, that that would be such a cool thing to ask myself, is everything that I'm doing leaving a better world for my daughter to grow up in. So that would, help define what I do, but also what I don't do. So, I probably wouldn't facilitate a session for a weapons manufacturer on how to be more effective at that, unless it was working for a weapons manufacturer, but how to get out of weapons and into the green space or something like that. But and I guess that almost serves the point of being a defining value. Is what I'm doing making it better or worse for what's going to be left behind? And if I were to really take it more seriously, it would really impact, how much I consume versus don't consume, how much I recycle and things like that. So there's been a really good conversation actually, because it made me think about, so now what I want to be doing differently if I really do want to hold on to that value and demonstrate it, regardless of whether or not it's easy to register a URL. That's the
Yeah.
easy part. The hard part
That's
is
fun.
living that.
Absolutely. I love that. And I think, yeah, you took it a few steps further too, which I really appreciate, is what are we going to say no to? Because I think that really helps us get clearer around the impact that we want to create, especially in a world that we get pulled in so many directions. So I think that's an important part of it as well.
Reza, this has been an absolute delight for me for many different things. First, having more time to connect. We just randomly met, less than a month ago, and here we are in this podcast, and I've really been enjoying it and what I've been thinking about myself, and hopefully some listeners about different perspectives on coaching and maybe what they want to do and consider getting a coach. So I will ask you, after we close off, to leave contact information for the program notes and things like that, should someone wish to reach out, find out more about you and what you do, maybe even contract your coaching services. But we're not selling here. I just want to leave the opportunity open for folks.
Absolutely. No, thank you for having me. I really enjoyed our conversation as well. I love your energy, your sense of humor, your curiosity and humility, and thanks for having me as part of your podcast.
It's my pleasure. I'm going to make sure I let my wife listen to this, especially the last part. So, David Gouthro, Discover Fresh Perspectives, here today with Reza. Reza, thank you so much. So, folks listening, come on back next week. I can guarantee it'll be a different person and some different perspectives. Subscribe now, because on Fresh Perspectives, every episode is an opportunity to explore new horizons and redefine what's achievable.